The night stretched on like an endless ribbon of darkness, interrupted only by the yellow arcs of light cast by Caroline's battered Ford Escort. The clock on her dashboard blinked 11:47 p.m. She had been driving for hours, the highway empty except for the occasional 18-wheeler roaring past in the opposite lane. Her fingers drummed the steering wheel in time with the crackling radio, which was barely picking up a station. Static hissed intermittently, and Caroline sighed, frustrated by the monotony. She had 100 miles left to reach her parents' house, where she planned to stay for the holidays. The road was bordered by dense woods, their silhouettes sharp and menacing under the pale sliver of moonlight. It was the kind of stretch where you didn't want to break down, or worse, stop for any reason. As she rounded a bend, her headlights caught a figure on the shoulder, thumb outstretched. A hitchhiker. Caroline slowed instinctively, her stomach knotting. The man wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. Something about his stance was odd, too rigid, too precise. Against her better judgment, she rolled her window down a crack as she came to a stop. "You okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man leaned down, his face coming into the light. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps in his 50s, with weathered skin and piercing eyes. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice gravelly but calm. "Car broke down a few miles back. Can you give me a lift?" Caroline hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to drive off, but she could hear her mother's voice chiding her. "What if it were you stranded out there?" "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Just up the road a bit." "Don't worry, I won't take you out of your way," he replied with a tight smile. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the passenger door. The man climbed in, his coat brushing against her arm as he settled into the seat. "Thank you," he said. "Not many would stop these days." "Name's William." "I'm Caroline," she replied, forcing a polite smile. She didn't offer her hand. The car filled with an awkward silence as she pulled back onto the highway. William sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees. The faint scent of damp earth clung to him, and Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, even when she kept her eyes on the road. "So," she began, trying to break the tension, "what happened to your car?" "Engine gave out," he said simply. Then, after a pause, he added, "I've been walking for hours. Thought I might not see another car tonight." She nodded, unsure how to respond. Something about his demeanor unnerved her. His answers were too short, too rehearsed. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. William hesitated. "Here and there. Been on the road a long time." The air between them grew heavier. Caroline felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. She glanced at him briefly and noticed his hands, calloused, dirt under the nails. The minutes dragged by, and the radio sputtered into static again. William reached out suddenly and turned it off. "Better without the noise," he muttered. Caroline gripped the wheel tighter. Her unease was mounting, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Then William spoke again. "You know it's dangerous out here," he said, his tone conversational but tinged with something darker. Caroline forced a laugh. "Yeah, I guess so. That's why I usually don't stop for strangers." William turned to her, his expression unreadable. "And yet you stopped for me." Her stomach flipped. Against her better judgment, she kept her eyes on the road, the white lines blurring in her peripheral vision. "I guess I felt bad," she said, trying to sound casual. He chuckled, low and dry. "Kindness can be a dangerous thing." The words hung in the air like a threat. Caroline's mind raced. She began calculating how much farther she'd have to drive before reaching a populated area, somewhere she could safely drop him off. As if sensing her discomfort, William leaned back and said, "Relax. I'm not going to hurt you." The reassurance only made her more nervous. They drove in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "Have you heard the story of the hitchhiker's warning?" he asked. Caroline shook her head, her throat too dry to answer. "It's an old tale," he continued, his voice low. "They say there's a man who roams these roads, hitchhiking. He looks normal enough, ordinary even, but anyone who picks him up never makes it to their destination." Caroline felt a chill crawl up her spine. She glanced at him, but his face was impassive, staring straight ahead. "Why not?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William smiled faintly. Because he warns them of something. And those who ignore the warning, well, they disappear. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. What kind of warning? He turned to her, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Usually something small. A piece of advice, a suggestion. Something that seems harmless at first. But it's never random. It's always tied to their fate. Caroline's hands trembled on the wheel. That's just a story, she said, more to herself than to him. William tilted his head, studying her. Is it? The car hit a pothole, jolting them both. Caroline cursed under her breath, her nerves fraying. Careful, William said. You don't want to lose control. She tightened her grip, her knuckles white. The highway seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in like a tunnel. Then, without warning, William pointed to the side of the road. You can let me off here. Caroline blinked. Here? There's nothing around. He nodded. This is far enough. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with confusion. She pulled onto the shoulder and stopped the car. William opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. Thanks for the ride, he said, tipping his hat. Caroline nodded, eager to get away. But as he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at her. One more thing, he said. Her heart sank. What? He leaned down, his face level with hers. Don't stop for anyone else tonight. The warning sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could respond, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Caroline sat there for a moment, her breath shallow. Then she shook her head, muttering, "Creepy old man," and pulled back onto the highway. She drove faster now, eager to put distance between herself and the encounter. But as the miles ticked by, she couldn't shake the unease. The road seemed darker, the trees more oppressive. It wasn't long before she saw another figure on the side of the road. Her heart leapt into her throat. This hitchhiker was different, a young woman, waving frantically. Her hair was wild, her clothes disheveled. She looked terrified. Caroline's foot hovered over the brake. The woman ran into the middle of the road, forcing her to stop. "Please," the woman cried, banging on the driver's window. "You have to help me. He's coming." Caroline's mind raced. She rolled down the window slightly. "What's going on?" "He's after me." The woman sobbed, glancing over her shoulder. "Please let me in." Caroline thought of William's warning. Don't stop for anyone else tonight. Her gut twisted. The woman's terror seemed genuine, but something about the situation felt wrong. "I'm sorry," Caroline said, her voice shaking. "I can't." The woman's expression changed in an instant. Her pleading eyes turned cold, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "You should have stopped," she hissed. Caroline's blood ran cold. She slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward as the woman's laughter echoed behind her. She didn't look back. The rest of the drive was a blur, her heart pounding in her ears. When she finally reached her parents' house, she stumbled out of the car and into the safety of their warm, brightly lit home. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped, that she had been warned, and that whatever was out there was still coming for her. The flickering fluorescent light above the mirror hummed with a faint, uneven rhythm, casting erratic shadows across the pale, tiled walls. Lisa leaned over the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror, her breath fogging the surface. She wasn't sure why she had come into this restroom in the first place. The college building was eerily silent, with most students long gone for the night. She had only stayed late to finish her paper in the library, but something about the sudden weight in her chest had urged her to step away and find a moment alone. The restroom, tucked into a forgotten corner of the old humanities building, had seen better days. The cracked tiles on the floor bore faint stains that no janitor had bothered to scrub away, and the lingering scent of mildew and disinfectant hung heavy in the air. The stalls stretched along one wall, their doors slightly ajar as if inviting her in. Above her, the vent fan rattled intermittently, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. Lisa glanced at her phone. No messages, no missed calls. The faint green glow of the screen offered little comfort. She sighed, pocketed it, and turned the faucet handle. The water sputtered out in short bursts, cool against her hands. She splashed her face, hoping to shake the nagging unease crawling up her spine. As she reached for a paper towel, the light above her buzzed louder. She paused, her hand hovering over the dispenser. Something was off. The humming wasn't the usual electrical static. It had a strange, rhythmic pattern, almost like breathing. She turned her head slightly, straining her ears. Then it stopped. The restroom fell silent, unnaturally so. Even the rattling vent fan had gone quiet, as if someone had flipped an invisible switch and muted the world. Lisa's skin prickled. She glanced toward the stalls, suddenly aware of how dark the space beyond the sink area appeared. The last stall's door swayed slightly, its hinges creaking. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely louder than a whisper. No response. Her pulse quickened as she backed away from the sink. The edges of her reflection in the mirror warped slightly, distorted by the cracked surface. Lisa's eyes darted between the mirror and the stalls, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. And then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the mirror. A shadow, darker than the dimly lit restroom, darted past the stalls and the reflection. Lisa spun around, her heart pounding. Nothing. The stalls stood as they were, silent and unoccupied. The door to the restroom was still propped open, the hallway beyond dimly lit by a flickering bulb. She turned back to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. But something was wrong. It wasn't her reflection. Lisa froze as she noticed the subtle differences. The woman in the mirror was wearing her clothes, had her hair, and mirrored her posture, but her eyes were wrong. Too dark, too hollow. In her mouth, it curled into a faint smile, something Lisa knew she wasn't doing. The light above her buzzed again, this time louder, more frantic. She stumbled back, her gaze fixed on the figure in the mirror. "Who?" she began, but the words caught in her throat as the figure raised a hand. Lisa's own hands were at her sides, trembling. She didn't move, but her reflection reached up and pressed its palm against the glass, leaving a smudge-like mark that began to spread, almost as if the mirror itself was bleeding ink. The restroom door slammed shut behind her. Lisa spun around, her breath coming in short gasps. She grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it didn't budge. The room's air grew colder, biting against her exposed skin. She turned back to the mirror, her heart thundering. The figure in the reflection was no longer there. The smudges had spread across the entire surface, transforming it into an opaque, black void. She stumbled toward the door again, pounding on it with both fists. "Help! Is anyone out there?" Her voice echoed in the empty halls, swallowed by the silence. A faint sound, a whisper, emerged from behind her. It was low and unintelligible at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew clearer with each passing second. "Lisa," she froze. The voice was unmistakable, yet impossible. It was her mother's voice. "Lisa, come here." Her mother had been dead for 3 years. Lisa turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The restroom was bathed in an unnatural, dim red glow now, the light seeping from the edges of the mirror. The stalls stood open, each door swaying slightly, creaking in unison. The voice came again, louder this time. "Lisa, why are you hiding?" Her mother's voice was layered with something else now, a guttural, echoing distortion that didn't belong. Lisa's legs trembled as she took a tentative step forward. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. The mirror rippled like water, the black void shifting and swirling. A hand, pale and slender, emerged from the surface, its fingers clawing at the edges of the glass. Lisa stumbled back, her body shaking with terror. "This isn't real. This isn't real," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. The hand was followed by another, then a face. It was her mother, or something that wore her face stretched and distorted like a mask. The figure crawled out of the mirror, its movements unnatural. its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. "Lisa," it crooned, its voice a sickening mix of her mother's tone and something ancient, something wrong. "I've missed you," Lisa screamed, bolting toward the stalls. She dove into the nearest one and locked the door, her hands fumbling with the latch. Her chest heaved as she pressed herself against the back wall, her eyes fixed on the crack beneath the stall door. The restroom was silent again, but she knew it was out there. A shadow passed under the stall door, and a low, rumbling laugh filled the room. "You can't hide forever," the voice sang. The latch began to rattle. Lisa clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay silent. Her eyes darted around the stall for anything she could use as a weapon. All she found was a broken piece of tile on the floor. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and held it close to her chest. The latch stopped moving. Lisa held her breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. The shadow beneath the door was gone. And then a whisper, so close it felt like it was inside her ear. "I'm already here." The whisper echoed in her mind, drowning out every other thought. Lisa's pulse hammered in her throat as she slowly lowered her hand, the shard of tile trembling in her grip. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever, but the fear rooted her to the floor of the stall. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, but something deep within her told her that the moment she opened that door, she would never escape. The air felt heavier now, thick with a suffocating pressure. It was like the room itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the sound of her heart pounding drowned everything else out. The low rattle of the door latch came again, but this time it wasn't just the latch. It was as if something was clawing at the walls, scraping against the tiles. The noise grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls of the restroom were alive, trying to tear themselves apart. Lisa opened her eyes, the tile shard still clenched in her hand. Through the crack in the stall door, the shadows began to shift. They seemed to pulse, undulating like smoke in the dim light. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but then the movement became more pronounced. The shadows stretched and twisted, taking shape, reaching toward her with impossible, jagged limbs. The walls groaned, as if the building itself was under duress. Lisa gasped, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. No, this can't be real. But it was. The shadows were closing in, inching toward her, inch by agonizing inch. Her breath came faster, and she could feel her hands growing numb with fear. She could hear the faintest scraping now, like claws against tile, like something hungry, something desperate. The whispers, her mother's voice twisted beyond recognition, filled the air. "Come closer, Lisa. I'm waiting for you." Her body trembled. There was no escape. The stall felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in on her. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. And then, with a sudden, piercing screech, the mirror in front of her shattered. Shards of glass exploded outward, glittering in the air like rain. Lisa flinched, ducking her head, instinctively covering her face with her arms. But when she dared to look up again, the mirror was intact. The black void that had once consumed it was gone, replaced by her own terrified reflection. But it wasn't her reflection anymore. Her reflection stood there, smiling. No, Lisa thought, a scream rising in her chest. "It's not me." Her reflection stepped forward. Its grin widening, as the dark figure of the shadow loomed behind her. Lisa's eyes snapped to the stall door, her only way out. The latch rattled again. The scraping intensified, and she knew the shadows were only moments away from breaking through. But just as the door cracked open, she saw it. A figure standing in the dim light of the hallway, framed by the flickering glow from the nearby exit. Someone was out there. She didn't wait to see who it was. With all the strength she could muster, Lisa lunged toward the stall door, pushing it open just enough to slip through. But as her hand touched the cold metal handle, a sharp, tugging force seized her from behind. It felt as if invisible hands were wrapping around her, pulling her back into the restroom. She fought, kicking and screaming, but the shadows were everywhere now. They filled the hallway, too, creeping under the doorframe, coiling up her legs like a serpent. "Lisa!" The whisper came again, colder this time, as if it were not her mother speaking at all. A sudden blinding flash of light filled the hallway, and the shadows recoiled. The tugging force loosened, and Lisa broke free, stumbling forward, gasping for breath. She turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. A man, his face obscured by the glare of the light behind him. "Who are you?" Lisa gasped, her voice shaky, weak. The man stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You need to leave now." Lisa shook her head, unable to comprehend. "The shadow. It's in there." He held up a hand. "I know what it is, and you don't want to be here when it wakes up." With no time to argue, Lisa ran, her feet pounding against the floor as she followed the man down the darkened hallway. But as she glanced back toward the restroom door, she saw the shadows pushing against the cracks. It's shifting, trying to break free. Behind her, the voice whispered once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't her mother. It was something else entirely, and it was getting closer. What happens next? The shadow has woken, and the man knows more than he's letting on. What is he hiding, and what is the dark force that haunts Lisa? The next part beckons, where the true horror begins to unfold. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or adjust anything further.